Welcome to the Sound for Video session. Today is the 11th of October, 2017. We have a ton of questions today. First of all, up from Aiken. Two quick questions. Is it possible that sound recorded by the A7S II camera mic can be out of sync? I recorded an interview recently and want to use the camera sounds track as a reference to sync up the audio from the Mix Pre 3, but the camera audio is at least 2 frames and possibly 3 frames out of sync. The answer to that is yes, it is very possible. And in fact, I have experienced that. You will see that mainly with kind of consumer, prosumer level cameras, kind of the category that the A7S is in. My Panasonic GH4 was consistently off by 2 frames. And I think it sometimes depends on the codec that you're using, that you have the camera set to. But yes, that's very possible. In those cases, it's critical to either slate, using a clapper board, clap your hands, something that gives you a visual reference, or if you are using Timecode, feeding a Timecode generator into the camera, some of the software allows you to apply a consistent offset to accommodate those types of out-of-sync issues. So really, it's a camera issue. It's not an issue with the Mix Pre 3. It's not an issue with the Zoom F-Series recorders. So it's really, yes, it is very much possible, unfortunately. Number 2, does shooting an interview at 30 frames per second have any effect on the ability to sync up the audio from the field recorder? No, it shouldn't have an issue at all. Shouldn't be a factor, really. The times when it's important to set the frame rate on the recorder is if you're using a timecode generator, because then it's recording each of the individual frames. So that's not entirely true. The way timecode works is it does a timestamp at the start of the recording if you're recording metadata timecode. If you're using audio or audio, essentially recording timecode to an audio track, then it does record it across the entire thing. But in any case, no, 30 frames per second should not be an issue. So hope that's helpful, Aiken. Thanks for the questions. Next up, we have a question from Kevin H. 2 questions. How do I effectively use a breakaway cable? Well, let's take a look. Breakaway cables are something I don't personally own one, but I have seen them used on various shoots. My understanding of the primary purpose of a breakaway cable, here's an example of one from Remote Audio, is that you have connected the audio recorder mixer to the camera. And the idea is that probably the main use case is that when the camera is done with shooting a particular scene and it's time to move on to the next thing, you can quickly disconnect all of these cables that you have connected between the camera and the recorder, and it's easy to move around. And then when you're set up for the next scene, you just reconnect the breakaway and you're set to go again. So it's generally one connection. There may be other benefits too. I'm not clear on, again, because I don't own one and I haven't used one. It could be that it's also a safety feature that I'm not sure how the breakaway part works, if it actually gives with enough pressure so that you don't trip someone on set, or it's less likely to pull the camera and the recorder over. I don't know if that's really the case. Maybe someone out there knows more about that. But I have seen this used on one set, and that's how we were using it there, is that it was an easy way to connect and disconnect the camera. And we were running audio directly to camera as Scratch. So you can see this breakaway cable here, for example, includes a timecode cable. It looks like it has a camera return. So the audio from the mixer or recorder is sent to the camera, and then it's also sent back from the camera to the mixer so that the audio mixer can actually hear what the camera is doing. So that's useful as well. So that's my understanding of a breakaway cable and how it's used. Secondly, what are some of the ins and outs of syncing timecode with my Zoom F4? I have a previous episode where we've talked about timecode. I didn't specifically use the Zoom H4 or F4, but the F4 is pretty much similar to every other kind of recorder that has an inbuilt timecode generator. So I'm going to just make a note for myself here to put a link for that in the description of this video. So you'll see that. We can run through the entire thing. The only thing that's unique about the Zoom F4, well, I mean, every recorder that has an inbuilt timecode generator, there are kind of a variety of different connectors they have. In the case of the Zoom F4, it's using BNC connectors. So if you are going to use timecode generators that you sync up to the F4 and then you connect the timecode generators to your camera, you will need a cable that has a BNC connector on the side that connects to the Zoom F4, and then you'll need a whatever type of cable that you need to connect the timecode generator then to your camera. So we'll put a link for that. Thanks for the question, Kevin. Next up from Toby M. What's the easiest way to remove some unwanted background noise such as insect sounds? Insect sounds can be tricky if you're talking, for example, about crickets. A lot of those sounds can be fairly broadband, which means that if you try to remove too much of it, you're going to start cutting into the dialogue or whatever other sound you're recording. So the strategy generally cannot be, with our current technologies that are available for denoising, really can't be to eliminate cricket sounds, but you can reduce them somewhat using the typical denoising plugins. I have a variety of videos here. I'll link you to one where we talked about that in the past. And in fact, it's interesting you bring that up because on one film that I worked on, a couple of scenes of, at least in terms of post-production mixing, we did have a scene with very, very loud crickets. And that's what we found, is you can't realistically expect to remove them, but you can expect to pull them back just a little bit so that they don't interfere necessarily so much with the dialogue. My sense is that you don't generally want to remove all of them anyway, because it gives context to the particular scene generally. Depends on what you're trying to accomplish, but that's my initial thought on that. Next thing you ask, Toby, I actually recorded the track straight into a digital Bolex D16. Also wondering your thoughts on this camera's audio quality. I've heard that the preamps are supposed to be okay for usable audio. Any thoughts on that? No, unfortunately, I have not used the digital Bolex. I would love to. It looks like a pretty fun little camera, but I have not used them. My sense is generally with cinema cameras, the audio inputs are okay. I've never found a camera with stellar audio inputs, but often they're okay. And generally what I find is they're pretty good for taking line level signals and recording those with the video footage. But if you have to connect a microphone, that's where they tend not to be amazing because they're not very good at clean amplification. They generally produce a fair bit of self noise. So again, that's not based on any experience I have with the digital Bolex, but that is generally cinema cameras. My experience is along those lines. If in the future I do much more audio into this camera, I thought of putting an old MixPre D on it to better monitor the audio. Any thoughts on that? This is just for running gun situations. Ordinarily, I would do dual audio. So yeah, I think that's a great idea. In fact, not just for monitoring, but actually you could have those do the amplification of the microphone level signal, then send from the MixPre a line level out from the MixPre to the camera, and you should get a cleaner signal overall in the camera recording that way. So good luck, Toby. Thanks for the question. Next up from Hans. Is it a good idea to have a pair of Avantone mix cubes for monitoring, post-audio, sound design, mixing, etc., combined with a pair of Rokit 5s as my overall primary speakers for movie watching, listening to music, finalizing audio-related post-work, etc.? So I would assume that the Rokit 5s would be your the monitors you would mix with, and then you would use the Avantones to kind of get a sanity check. Have a very small room that I eventually want to turn into a small DIY editing sound studio. I intend to invest for corner bass traps and acoustic panels along the way. If this is not a good combo, what would you recommend instead? Well, Hans, I think that's actually not a bad combo. What I would say, however, just for those that are not aware, the Avantone Active Mix Cubes are these kind of retro-looking monitors. And they are not ported. They are just simply a single speaker, mid-range speaker. And what they're typically used for, why they're popular, is that music mixing engineers like to use them as, not for their primary mixing monitors necessarily, but to check a mix once they've finished it, or they at least have a draft of it. And the reason they do that is twofold. Number one, they like the fact that these are very mid-tone focused, not a lot of bass, not a lot of high end. They kind of represent what you might hear in a supermarket playback system, or in other very bad public playback systems or mediocre playback systems. And so what it does is it allows you to kind of get a sense for how this is going to sound on less than optimal playback scenarios. And that's the main purpose of them. From my point of view, what they do is they also help you to learn your primary mixing monitors. They help you get they kind of give you a little a boost up, kind of a head start, or make it a little easier to more quickly understand the strengths and the weaknesses, or the places where your primary monitors tend to emphasize things too much or underemphasize things. So that's kind of their main purpose. Frankly, they're not necessary. And if you're on a budget, I think that the Rokit G5s are probably a good place to start. They're not perfect. I have a set of Rokit 8s that I used for quite a while, and they're actually pretty decent monitors, except that the high end is a little bit smeary. It's not as clear as some higher end monitors, plain and simply. But does that mean you can't make good mixes on them? Absolutely not. You just need to understand, over time, you get used to listening to reference material, so you know what it sounds like. You come to understand where you can't necessarily rely on these monitors, or you understand where they tend to overemphasize things or underemphasize things. And then that just becomes part of your overall mixing process. So, Hans, what I'm saying is you don't need the Avantones. They can be helpful in terms of learning the Rokits, but they're not absolutely necessary. If I were starting, probably what I would do is I'd get the Rokit 5s and invest a little bit of money in acoustic treatment up front. And then if you feel like later you're not necessarily progressing as quickly as you'd like, then maybe add the Avantones. But I don't know that they're really critical. And I know I talked about the Avantones in previous episodes. But that's really, hopefully that provides you a little more context on why I think they can be a useful tool, but I don't think they're necessarily what you need to buy up front. So different people feel differently about that. I think what is important is get a decent set of monitors and learn them. And the way you learn them is you play reference material. That is, you play material, sound that you've heard on other playback systems in lots of different circumstances, ideally. And so you know what to expect. And that way you get a sense for what your monitors, in this case, for example, the Rokit 5s, are good at and not good at, or what they emphasize or de-emphasize. So hopefully that makes sense. Thanks for the question, Hans. It's a good one. All right, next up from J.H. Brooks, how much of a difference is there between sound blankets, moving blankets, and quilts when trying to cut down reflection or echo in an interview in a large room? That is a fantastic question, and it depends on the moving blankets, and it depends on the quilts, and it depends on the sound blankets. The thing about sound blankets is that they're actually designed for the purpose of cutting down, absorbing especially high-frequency sound that's bouncing around in a room. So that's really what they're good at. The way they make those, the things or the characteristics of those sound blankets that make them effective at that are two things. Number one, the fabric on the outside is a fairly coarse weave so that sound can actually pass through it as opposed to bouncing off it and just slapping back, just like exactly what you're trying to prevent. So that's the first thing. Second thing, they are very heavy. They have a lot of mass, usually of cotton or cotton-like material inside of them that does the absorption. So that's how sound blankets are unique. Now, there are some moving blankets out there that are very heavy and probably could do just as good a job. It just depends on the particular blanket. I actually went to my local hardware store once and looked at moving blankets, and the ones they had there had a synthetic fabric on the outside, presumably to help them stand up, to be tough. But I don't know that acoustically they would have been the best choice. There may have been some potential slap or reflection off of that. And secondly, they were much lighter weight than the sound blankets that I have, so they wouldn't have as much absorptive capability. That's just to say those are the particular ones I looked at. It depends on the moving blankets you're talking about. Now, quilts, same thing. Depending on the cover fabric, they can be good or not as good. I would just try them. If you're really trying to save money, I would do quilts first of all. If whatever quilts you happen to have on hand or duvets or whatever, try them and see what difference you get. Use your ears as your guide. That's the important thing. So, I think sound blankets can generally be the most effective because they're purpose-built for that. They're incredibly heavy. In fact, they're kind of a pain to schlep around on set, but they're worth it because, again, they do a pretty good job. I'm finding over time that for the most part, where I ended up using them is throwing them down on hard floors, and that makes a significant difference. So there's an answer for you. I would experiment with what you've got. If you're trying to save money, use whatever quilts you have on hand, do some tests and see what happens. And then same, if you happen to have moving blankets on hand, test with those and see what you get. If you're not happy with those, it might be time to invest in sound blankets. Sound blankets are one of the most affordable things you can buy to make a dramatic difference in the quality of your recordings in reverberant rooms. So, great question. Thanks for that one. Next up, we have a variety of questions from Roman. Roman, I'm not going to be able to go into a ton of detail on all of these, but let's at least touch on them, and perhaps it can spark some additional conversation. You can do follow-ups in future sessions, or perhaps it'll lead to a dedicated session on one of these topics. First of all, in your videos, you mentioned you don't like the sound from the Rode NTG4 Plus. I found a good alternative, the Sennheiser MK600. It has a AA battery power or 48 phantom volt. I think it's a better option than charging via USB on the Rode NTG4. Can it be? It can be used as an on-camera mic with an XLR to 1/8-inch TRS cable. What's your thought about that mic? My thought is I've used it. My brother owns it. It's okay. It's a pretty bright mic from my experience. It wasn't my favorite sound, but it can be especially good on people with dark voices. That is to say, people that don't have a whole lot of higher end sound coming out of them. And there are voices like that. So it's a good option. I think it's a good microphone. I actually probably would prefer it over the NTG4 Plus. The NTG4 Plus sounds fine on some people, but there are a lot of people it doesn't sound great on, is my personal bias and experience. So that's just an opinion. All right, next up, you ordered one without any accessories. What's the best budget upgrade over a standard kit? Okay, here's where you're talking about shock mounts. Shock mounts are important. This is how you make sure that you're not transferring a bunch of noise from microphone movement into the recording. And you list a bunch of them. Here's the Rycote InVision shock mount. Here's one from Sennheiser. You talk about just a plain old shoe mount. That's another option. The Rycote shotgun mic foam and windjammer combo, which is pretty affordable. And then we also have the Rycote Softy, which is a pretty popular option as well. So you're looking at shock mounts and wind protection. So let's talk about shock mounts first. I have never used the Sennheiser. I don't know how well it works. Based on what I see from the design, it's probably not as effective as a Lyre system like this. This is the kind of thermoplastic. I've had very good luck with the Rycotes. In fact, I have a Rycote shock mount that's very much like this one. It has a slightly different knob over here, but same idea. It grips the mic. It's got the Lyre system to isolate the boom pole movement from the microphone. And these work really, really well. I've been happy with these. This one, again, I have never used, and so I don't have any experience where I can say one way or the other. Just based on a visual look at it, it probably, I would guess that it's not as effective as something like this. Unless what this would be good for is if you're just going to be putting a boom pole on a Century stand and just leaving it there. Probably plenty for that. But if you're actually going to be hand booming, then I think you're going to want something more like this. And this I guess you would use to mount directly to a camera. Yeah, that would work fine, I would think. I would probably prefer this type of shock mount if you're going to put it on your camera over something like that. All right, next up for wind protection. So this is a windjammer, which is the furry cover, and then you've got this foam here. These are okay for the very slightest of breezes. If you've got a stiffer wind, this one works a little better, but if it's too much wind, then you really need a blimp style or Zeppelin style cover. In my case, I use the Rycote Cyclone. That's an expensive, very expensive wind cover. I don't know, $600-ish. But it's a very high quality shock mount and wind protection. It's probably Rycote's best, and I've been very, very happy with it. So there are less expensive options. Rode, for example, has the blimp. They updated that a couple of years ago. In fact, let's just pull that up here so you can see that. That one's around $300, so it's about half the price. Yeah, here's what I'd be looking at. About half the price. And in fact, the shock mount is made by Rycote. This is pretty good. I have a friend that has this one, and he's had very good results with it. The only difference between this and the Cyclone at twice the price is that this is a little bit heavier, and it uses a different material. It uses kind of the more traditional style Zeppelin cover. Whereas a Cyclone, just to show you the Cyclone in case someone here hasn't seen it before, the Cyclone looks like this. It has a different material. It's an asymmetrical design, which is supposed to potentially help so you don't get unusual resonances within the Zeppelin cover. So in any case, those are my thoughts on wind protection. I would say this, the kind of just the foam, and if you're going to buy wind protection for outdoors, I would definitely go for something like this or like this. This is kind of a lightweight one. If you're going to be in heavier winds, something more like this. These types of things generally, in my experience, don't work as well. So there are my thoughts on that. All right. So you've also say sometimes you've seen it indoors on set. What's that for? Well, yeah, if you use one of these covers indoors, obviously there shouldn't be any wind, or generally there isn't any wind indoors. But if you do, I've seen them on. It's just it'll attenuate some of the high frequency sound that the microphone picks up. So if you're trying to go for a specific effect, that can be fine. Otherwise, you should generally take them off. Indoors, I will typically just use a foam cover, usually the one that just comes with the microphone. But you don't have to do that either. If you're looking to get a crisper sound, you can just take the foam cover off as well and just use the mic bear. So that's the general thoughts on that. What are the advantages to have an audio interface? What is your experience with the Sound Devices Mix Pre 6 as an audio interface and headphone amp? Well, the advantages of having an audio interface are that you can record directly to your computer using XLR-based microphones. So generally not something you can do with your computer otherwise. And then for playback and for mixing, they generally have a higher quality digital to analog converter and usually line level outputs or at least headphone outputs that allow you to monitor the audio, again, at a higher quality than you're generally going to find in a computer. So those are the main advantages. My experience using the Mix Pre 6 as an audio interface, I like it as a mobile audio interface where I'm driving headphones, where I'm listening on headphones. It works very, very nicely. If you do need to hook that up to powered monitors, I found with the Mix Pre 6, you really probably want a direct box. And I talk about that in the Mix Pre 6 course if you want the details on that. It's probably more than we can cover here. So in any case, next up, what are your tips on fixing or redoing actors' voiceover and sound design for small films? That's a huge question. Stick around. I'll put some links for some of our previous sessions that cover some of those topics. Whoops. Yeah, I'll put some links. So it is a huge pile of questions. They're all good. It definitely shows that you're learning. So Roman, thanks for those. Appreciate that. All right, next up, James B. He's enjoying the course. That's fantastic news. You are getting ready to set up your computer from 2 to 3 screens and also buy your first set of near-field monitors. However, you're not sure how to manage to place them when the screens will take up so much space. My current plan is to raise them up above the screens and angle them down. I wonder if this is an effective solution, but also I'm concerned about working in such a small room and the sound reflecting at odd angles, which could make treating the room harder. That's a good question. I'm not an acoustician, so I can't say for certain, but my thinking is this. Generally, what you want to do is with your monitors, you want to create a triangle. Ideally, you'll have the monitors so that the tweeters are based at ear level. This is my understanding. And then you want an equilateral triangle. The distance between the two monitors should be the same as the distance of each of the monitors from your ears. You can angle them up or down. That's fine. And yes, it can potentially change where the first reflection points are within the room and how the sound interacts with the room. But that's just something you'll have to experiment with. What I would suggest is you can definitely put them above the monitors and angle them down. You could also, depending on how you have your monitor set up, you could also, I don't know, it sounds like you're planning to put the 3 monitors side by side. And if that's what you're going to do, then probably putting them up above and aiming down is your best bet. You may need to put some treatment on the floor. I don't know what your floors are made of, but it may be that you want to, usually what you do is you treat your first reflection points where the sound comes out of the monitors and first hits a wall or other surface. Typically, you want to treat that surface with a bass trap or a broadband trap. So what you may need to do in that case is you may need to put some sort of treatment on the floor if you're going to have them up high, pointing down at a fairly steep angle, or that it may actually be lower on the wall. Whatever it is, you just want to treat those first reflection points, is my understanding. So I think it's totally doable, James, and just have to do a little experimenting with it to see how it comes out. But yeah, that's definitely a way you can solve that problem. I think that's fine. All right, next up from Adrian. He just finished the the production of sound fundamentals course. So he's asking a couple of questions. First question is, what is ratio? Second question, sound floor. So in the post-processing module, I referred to using a compression ratio of 2:1 or 3:1, and then we'll come back to the sound floor. So, okay, let's hop over to Audition here. So I have a waveform here, some audio that I recorded. When I'm compressing it, I typically look at this ratio right here. This ratio determines how much compression is applied. That is to say, how much these peaks are squashed down or compressed. So for example, in this particular case, if I set my threshold, which is at where the top of this window is, at minus 12 dB, that means that every part of the waveform that extends above this, or correspondingly below minus 12 on this side, that would be anything below this window here, will get compressed. Okay, that's the first piece. Second piece, how much it gets compressed is determined by the ratio. So in this case, for example, we are essentially 3 dB above the threshold. So this waveform extends about 3 decibels above where I have the threshold set at minus 12. What that means, if I set the compression ratio to 3:1, when the compressor processes this part of the waveform here, it will take this 3 dB that are above the threshold and squash it down till it's only 1 dB above the threshold. That's what the ratio refers to. So it's just a measure of how much compression the compressor is applying. So hopefully that makes sense. The second question you had to do with noise floor. So noise floor is pretty much the concept of where the sound sits in terms of amplitude when there is silence in your recording. And I use air quotes for that because there's never perfect silence. So for example, if I measure this right here with the amplitude statistics, it says right now that that's sitting at about minus 70. I'm just looking at the average RMS in this case, it's kind of an average. What that's telling me is that there's not a lot of noise here. All I was saying in that post-processing module is that when I finish my audio, I'm generally trying to keep the noise floor sitting at minus 60 dB or lower. That's just so that it doesn't become a distraction to the audience. That's just, again, it's just a rule of thumb. It doesn't have to be. That's generally just what I use as a rule of thumb. In this case, we would be fine because we're sitting at minus 70. So there's an example for you. Hope that makes sense and clears that up a little bit for you. So thanks for the question there, Adrian. All right, that is all the questions we had for this week. I hope those were helpful. Thanks so much for those questions. They're really good. And again, they indicate that you're definitely thinking about this. You're definitely making some improvements. I hope your recordings are reflecting that. They're getting better all the time. Thanks again. We'll talk to you again next week.